When the stained glass window exploded in the chapel, who would speak the truth? The careless servant, or the only one who threw herself in the way to shield a child? If this story touches your heart, please subscribe to follow the whole journey. The late afternoon light of Bedford in early winter carried a chill that made even the stone walls of the Hartley estate feel brittle. On the western side of the grounds, nestled between the tall spruces and a long-forgotten rose garden, stood a small chapel. Its oak doors bore the weather of decades, but the jewel-like stained glass window above the altar remained Clara Hartley's favorite refuge. She was only 6 years old, and since her mother's death the year before, the world had seemed to her like an echoing corridor filled with silence. Yet within the chapel, when light streamed through the fractured colors of saints and vines, Clara felt warmth, as if heaven bent low just for her. That afternoon she tiptoed inside with Amara Johnson, the housekeeper whose voice carried both patience and song. Amara lit the battery-powered candles placed along the altar rail. Nicholas Hartley, Nick to the world of boardrooms and Silicon Valley headlines, was still at his office in Manhattan. The estate was quieter without him. Clara wandered toward the center aisle, her small shoes tapping softly on stone. "It feels like Mommy is here," she whispered, looking at the colored light dancing on her hands. Amara smiled, though her heart clenched. "Then let's keep her close," she said, setting another candle aglow. Outside, the wind gathered with the impatience of December storms. The oak trees creaked, and the great oaken door of the chapel rattled in its hinges. No one had inspected the door closer in years. Philip Crane, the estate manager, had marked the maintenance order as non-essential. The gust came suddenly, slamming the door with such force that the air inside shifted like a bellows. A pressure differential rippled through the nave. The leaded stained glass window, already compromised by hairline fractures invisible to the eye, shuddered. A sharp crack followed, like the report of a rifle. Then a rain of shards cascaded from above. Amara did not think. She moved. Throwing herself over Clara, she spread her arms to shield the child. Jagged fragments slashed into her hands and forearms, embedding with the sting of fire. Glass lacerations opened deep lines across her skin. She pressed Clara to the ground beneath her body as a kaleidoscope of broken colors showered around them. Clara gasped, eyes wide with terror. One fragment grazed her cheek before falling harmlessly onto the floor. The child trembled but was uncut. Amara, however, felt the warm flow of blood run down her wrists. "Stay still, baby. I've got you," Amara whispered. With her uninjured hand, she reached for the linen cloth near the altar, wrapping it tightly across her bleeding palm. She knew enough first aid, direct pressure, improvised bandage, no time to think of pain. Clara began to cry, clinging to Amara's blouse. The candles flickered in the sudden draft, their small lights barely steady against the wind seeping through the shattered window. Amara gathered the child in her arms, stepping carefully through the shards. Each crunch beneath her shoes echoed in the empty chapel. She pushed the heavy door open with her shoulder and staggered out into the cold evening air. Her vision swam, but she held Clara high and safe. With trembling fingers, she dialed 911. "Emergency! What's your location?" came the dispatcher's voice. "This is Hartley Estate." "The chapel," Amara gasped. "Stained glass collapsed. Child inside. Injuries. Please hurry." Within minutes, the sound of sirens began to echo faintly over the hills. Nicholas Hartley arrived before the ambulance. He had cut short his meeting when the estate alarm notified him of an emergency. His sleek, black car skidded onto the gravel path, headlights piercing the dusk. He leapt out, his tailored coat flaring behind him, heart pounding with one thought only: Clara. And there she was, in Amara's arms, pale but conscious, her hair tangled with flecks of colored glass. Nick's eyes fell next to Amara's hands, crimson soaking through makeshift bandages, drops falling onto Clara's sleeve. Panic roared through him like a beast. He tore the child from Amara's arms, voice raw. "What did you do to my daughter?" His words struck harder than the storm outside. Amara tried to speak, but the sirens grew louder. The ambulance screeched into the courtyard, paramedics rushing with equipment. They pried Clara gently from Nick's grip to assess her. Another medic turned to Amara, taking in the blood-soaked towel. "She needs sutures, possible tendon exposure," the medic called. "Direct pressure hasn't stopped it. Let's get her on a gurney." Nick stood frozen, Clara's small fingers clutching at his collar. She was trembling, frightened, whispering his name. The medics noted her vitals. GCS 15, pupils equal and reactive, only superficial abrasions. Still, Nick's world narrowed to the sight of blood. His daughter's sleeve marked, Amara's hands dripping. "You let this happen," he whispered furiously to Amara as the gurneys rolled toward the ambulance. "Your carelessness could have killed her." Amara said nothing. Her lips tightened against the pain, not of her wounds, but of the words that cut deeper. The last thing she saw before the doors closed was the great chapel window, once a mosaic of light, now a hollow frame staring into the darkening sky. The ambulance roared away, sirens rising like a mournful hymn, while the sun dipped low behind the Bedford Hills, casting fractured light through the ruined glass. The sirens wailed all the way from Bedford to Greenwich, a sound that pierced Nicholas Hartley's chest like a blade. In the back of the ambulance, Clara's tiny frame lay on the stretcher, her eyes wide but responsive, her breath quick as a bird's. Paramedics murmured their shorthand. GCS 15, pupils equal, reactive, mild abrasions, monitor pediatric neurocheck. Nick clung to her hand as if letting go would cost her life. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered against the panic pounding in his skull. Every shadow in the ambulance seemed sharper, every second longer. Across from them, Amara sat strapped on a side bench. Her forearms and hands were swathed in layers of gauze, crimson already seeping through. She kept silent, teeth clenched, though the paramedics urged, "Try to keep the arm elevated, ma'am." She obeyed, her gaze fixed only on Clara, whose lips quivered with the effort not to cry. The ambulance screeched to a halt beneath the canopy of Greenwich Hospital's emergency department. Glass doors flew open, and 2 trauma bays prepared simultaneously, one for the child, one for the injured adult. Doctors and nurses swept Clara onto a pediatric gurney, attaching monitors, checking oxygen saturation, palpating her scalp for hidden contusions. A young resident murmured, "She's stable, no LOC, just observation and neurochecks overnight." Amara, meanwhile, was guided into a separate bay. A surgical nurse pulled off her bloodied cloth, revealing long, jagged lacerations crossing her palm and wrist. "Deep glass lacerations, possible tendon involvement. We need irrigation, tetanus booster, prophylactic antibiotics. Suture with 4-0 nylon after debridement." The nurse rattled off orders with practiced speed. Amara winced as saline burned into open flesh. Still, she kept twisting in her seat, craning to glimpse Clara through the curtain. Only when a nurse reassured, "The little girl is fine, sweetheart," did she exhale a shaky breath. Nick stormed down the corridor, his Italian shoes striking the tile like gunshots. He found Clara's bay, where she sat upright, a nurse shining a penlight into her pupils. Her cheeks were streaked with tears, but she was awake, answering questions with small nods. "Daddy," she whispered, and that word alone almost dropped him to his knees. He kissed her forehead fiercely, holding her trembling shoulders. But as his eyes drifted beyond the curtain, they landed on Amara, her arm outstretched, her face pale with blood loss, a doctor stitching slow, precise lines across her palm. The sight of her, wounded yet still watching Clara with maternal intensity, should have softened him. Instead, it ignited something harsher: blame. Mara Collins, the head of PR for Hartley Group, arrived within the hour, heels clicking on the sterile floor. She had been briefed by Philip Crane before leaving Manhattan. "Optics are terrible," she whispered urgently to Nick. "A child nearly injured under staff supervision inside your own chapel? We must mitigate. Put her on administrative leave immediately, at least until the liability picture clears. This is textbook risk management." Nick's jaw tightened. The words tasted like iron, but fear for Clara drowned out hesitation. He strode into Amara's bay just as the final suture was tied. She looked up at him, expecting perhaps gratitude, perhaps reassurance. Instead, she found his face carved in stone. "You will be placed on leave, effective immediately," he said flatly. "HR will process it tonight. While I decide how to proceed, you are not to enter the estate. Do you understand?" The nurse glanced between them, shocked. Amara's lips parted, but no words emerged. She simply nodded, her eyes dimming like candles smothered by wind. Nick's voice cracked, louder now, echoing against stainless steel trays. "Your carelessness nearly killed my daughter. You were supposed to protect her, not put her in harm's way." The accusation landed deeper than any shard of glass. Amara lowered her gaze to the gauze wrapped around her hands, already stained dark through the bandage. She signed the release papers with difficulty, her handwriting uneven from pain. Each stroke of the pen felt like another verdict pronounced against her. Outside, Mara Collins spoke briskly to Nick. "Crisis communications draft is ready. We'll say Clara had a minor fall during playtime. No mention of glass. No mention of the maid." Nick nodded, barely listening. His eyes kept darting back to Clara's bay, where his daughter now slept under a soft hospital blanket, her small hand clutched around the stuffed bear a nurse had given her. The sound of Amara's stretcher wheels rolled past. She was being moved to radiology for an X-ray, to check for retained glass fragments. Nick turned away, his throat burning. He could not bear to look at her, not when every beat of his heart screamed fear for his child. Yet Clara stirred in her sleep, murmuring faintly. Nick bent close and heard the words slip from her lips like a secret prayer. "Amara." It pierced him more than the ambulance siren had, but pride and panic held him immovable. He straightened, pulling his coat tight, and told himself that he had done what any father must: remove risk, impose order, protect at all costs. Still, as the night deepened over Greenwich Hospital and the sterile hum of machines filled the corridors, there lingered the image of bloodied hands shielding his daughter, an image he tried and failed to erase. In Bedford, news traveled in whispers faster than any ambulance could race down I-95. By the following morning, the story had already begun to mutate in drawing rooms, charity brunches, and country clubs that dotted Westchester and Greenwich. "Did you hear? Little Clara Hartley nearly died in the chapel," a woman murmured across crystal flutes at the Bedford Hills Country Club. "And they say it was the maid's fault. Careless, leaving a child near broken glass," another replied, lips pursed as if savoring scandal. By evening, the narrative had taken root. The daughter of Nicholas Hartley, the tech billionaire, nearly killed by his own staff. Mara Collins, head of PR for Hartley Group, was already orchestrating damage control. She drafted talking points, whispered legal advice into Nick's ear. "We will not use the word accident. Too vague. The safest path is internal silence, an NDA for all staff. We frame this as a private family matter." At the estate, Philip Crane enforced the chill. Staff who had once laughed with Amara over late-night tea now avoided her eyes. Conversations hushed the moment she entered the kitchen. The laundry girl, normally quick with jokes, pressed her lips shut and slipped away. Clara remained at Greenwich Hospital for observation, but even from a distance, the weight of suspicion pressed on Amara's chest, heavier than any bandage. She returned to her small servant's room, now stripped of warmth, and sat on the narrow bed. Her bandaged hands throbbed with each pulse. On the bedside table lay a single white envelope. Notice of administrative leave. It bore Nick's signature, neat and cold. Her phone buzzed. A message from an old church friend popped up with a link. Someone had posted in a social media group followed by the upper-crust families of Westchester. Hartley heiress in peril, housemaid's negligence to blame. The post had already attracted dozens of comments. Speculations spilling into cruel certainty. Amara's heart sank. She had lived her life careful and quiet, avoiding the spotlight. Yet now her name was in the mouths of strangers, twisted into a cautionary tale. She closed her eyes and prayed silently. Then came a knock at her door. It was Thomas, the estate's gardener, his face weathered by years of sun and soil. He shuffled nervously, cap in his hands. "I shouldn't be here," he whispered, glancing down the hall. "But I thought you should know. That window." "What about it?" Amara's voice was hoarse. "I reported a crack. A hairline fracture, you could see it when the light hit just right. That was last month. I filed a work order." His jaw clenched. "Philip crossed it off, said budget cuts, said no one used the chapel anyway." Amara felt her breath still. Pieces of a puzzle shifted in her mind. She remembered the faint distortion in the glass weeks earlier, the way the lead lines seemed uneven. She had thought it odd, but trusted maintenance records she had no access to. Thomas squeezed her shoulder gently. "You didn't do this. But they'll let you take the fall if you don't fight." He left quickly, afraid to linger. Alone again, Amara opened her laptop with trembling hands. She began drafting her resignation letter. It was not out of guilt. She knew she had thrown herself over Clara like a shield. But perhaps, she thought, removing herself from the estate would protect the child from further whispers. Better for Clara to grow up without scandal trailing her like a shadow. The words came slowly. "For the sake of Miss Clara's peace and your family's privacy, I hereby resign my position." She stopped, staring at the blinking cursor. Tears blurred her vision. This was not just a job. It was shelter, a chance to provide for her younger brother's college fund, the only steady ground she had built since leaving the Bronx. But the voices of gossip roared louder in her memory. The maid was careless. The maid nearly killed her. She folded her hands, bandaged and raw, over the keyboard. In her chest, a battle waged. Surrender or hold fast until truth emerged. Downstairs in the estate office, Philip Crane poured himself a drink. The headlines hadn't named him. His position remained intact, at least for now. He leaned back in his chair, smug, knowing that in Nick's eyes, the blame had already found a convenient scapegoat. Yet in town, the rumor circuit hummed like an electric current. At Bedford's Bakery, at Greenwich's charity luncheons, in whispers during Sunday Mass, the story of the careless maid spread, polished with each retelling until fiction gleamed brighter than fact. And through it all, Clara Hartley, still at the hospital, stirred in restless dreams, whispering the same name that the world now dragged through the mud. Amara. That night, Amara sealed the envelope with her resignation letter inside, but her hands trembled as she placed it on the desk. She knew she could deliver it tomorrow, or perhaps she could hold it just one more day, long enough to find proof of what Thomas had told her. The house around her groaned in silence, chandeliers dimmed, servants asleep. Amara sat in darkness, staring at the folded paper, knowing that her choice, silence or truth, would decide not only her own future, but Clara's as well. The whispers outside the estate walls grew louder. And yet, in Amara's heart, a different whisper stirred, not of defeat, but of resolve. The Hartley estate was silent when Amara rose before dawn. She had not slept. Her bandaged hands throbbed with every pulse, but the pain was secondary to the storm inside her mind. On the desk, the envelope containing her resignation still waited, unsealed, like a verdict she could not yet deliver. She crossed the hallway to her small dresser and pulled open the lowest drawer. From beneath neatly folded uniforms, she lifted a canvas pouch, worn from years of use. Inside lay her most treasured possession, a set of safety glasses, tweezers, and a magnifying loupe, the tools of her long-ago volunteer work at a church in the Bronx. For nearly 2 years before coming to Bedford, she had offered her Saturdays to St. Agnes Parish, where a leaky roof had threatened its century-old stained glass windows. There, under the guidance of a retired glazier, she learned the vocabulary of light and fracture. She remembered the feel of lead came beneath her fingertips, the smell of solder, the delicate lines where a crack told the story of stress and pressure. Words like fractography, nickel sulfide inclusion, thermal shock were not jargon to her, but living things, whispered lessons of how fragile beauty could break. That knowledge now pulled her back to the chapel, though fear pressed at her every step. The scene was cordoned off, caution tape fluttering at the doorway. But inside, beneath the cold wash of dawn, shards of colored glass still littered the floor, glinting like spilled jewels. Amara knelt carefully. Ignoring the sting in her sutured hands, she lifted a fragment the size of a child's palm, edges jagged, its surface rippled with telltale hackle marks. Beneath the loupe, she found what she feared and expected, conchoidal shell patterns radiating outward. Not the imprint of blunt force, not from clumsy handling, but the unmistakable fingerprint of stress failure. She gathered more pieces, arranging them on a cloth as if restoring a mosaic. Each shard told the same truth. The window had been poised to fail for weeks, maybe months. The slam of the oak door had been the trigger, but the fault lay in the long neglect of the structure itself. Her chest tightened. She thought of Clara's small body beneath that storm of glass, how close the child had come to tragedy. And then she thought of Nick's voice at the hospital, sharp with accusation. "Your carelessness nearly killed her." She closed her eyes against the sting of memory, but when she opened them again, clarity cut through. She could not walk away. Not until the truth stood where all the whispers now tried to bury her. Back in her room, she opened her laptop. Buried in her email archive was the estate's maintenance bulletin, circulated weekly. She scrolled until she found the line Thomas had mentioned. Chapel stained glass. Hairline crack noted. Attached was the electronic signature of the gardener's report, but below it, a bold red strike-through and initials, PC, Philip Crane. The entry marked as resolved, no action. Amara stared, her breath shallow. Proof. Not speculation, not whisper, but evidence that someone had dismissed a warning. She saved the email, printing a copy despite the tremble in her fingers. When the printer clicked, she felt the moment like a drumbeat. She was no longer a servant waiting for mercy. She was a witness. But fear coiled close. Philip was powerful within the estate, his loyalty to Nick spanning decades. He controlled budgets, vendors, and most of all, the narrative. Confronting him could mean ruin. Still, Amara folded the paper and slipped it into her pocket. Her resignation letter remained on the desk, untouched. As night fell, she sat by her narrow window gazing at the frosted trees. Memories of the Bronx returned, nights when she and her younger brother huddled in a drafty apartment, patching leaks with cardboard. Back then, she had dreamed only of safety. It was what drew her to caring for others. What had carried her into domestic work at Hartley Estate? Safety. That was what Clara deserved. And if no one else would secure it, Amara would. A knock startled her. It was one of the younger maids, timid, carrying a tray. "They told me to bring this. Supper." Amara managed to smile, though her appetite was gone. "Thank you." The girl hesitated, then whispered, "I know you didn't do it. I saw you run to her. We all did." "But," she faltered. "Mr. Crane said it's best we keep quiet. For the family." Amara's heart ached at the fear in the girl's eyes. Silence in the name of loyalty. That was the oldest chain of all. When the maid slipped away, Amara unrolled her bandages and winced at the raw lines beneath. She washed them gently, each sting a reminder of what she had endured for Clara. As she rewrapped the gauze, she whispered to herself, "Not silence. Not this time." She placed the shard of glass she had studied earlier on her nightstand. Its fractured surface caught the dim lamplight, scattering it into muted rainbows. It looked broken, but when light passed through, it still glowed. Amara lay back on her bed, exhaustion tugging at her, the evidence safe in her pocket. Tomorrow, she vowed, she would face Philip, and she would not stand alone. The next morning, frost glazed the stone steps of the Hartley estate. Nicholas had left early for Manhattan, leaving the estate quiet, its grand halls muffled in winter stillness. Amara clutched the folded printout in her pocket, the work order marked, "Resolved no action." The evidence. She found Philip Crane in his office, a paneled room lined with ledgers, vendor contracts, and framed certificates that gave the impression of order. He sat behind a walnut desk, glasses perched low, sipping coffee. The moment she entered, his eyes narrowed. "You shouldn't be here," he said sharply. "You're on leave." Amara closed the door. "I need answers." Philip smirked. "Answers? You should be grateful you weren't dismissed outright." "Nicholas is merciful, more than I advised." Amara steadied herself, pulling the paper from her pocket and laying it on the desk. "You marked this as resolved. The gardener reported a crack in the chapel glass a month ago. You ignored it." Philip's smile faltered for the briefest second before he leaned back, folding his hands. "Budgets are not infinite, Miss Johnson. The chapel is decorative, not essential. We had higher priorities, HVAC for the main house, security system upgrades." "Choices must be made." "Choices?" Amara's voice shook. "That choice nearly killed Clara. You swapped laminated safety glass for annealed cut-rate panes. You crossed out a work order that could have saved her, and now the blame is on me." His gaze turned cold. "Careful. You signed a confidentiality clause. Discussing internal maintenance records outside authorized channels is a breach of contract. That paper in your hand? Dangerous. For you." Amara felt her throat tighten, but she pressed on. "I was there when it shattered. I saw the fractography. This wasn't carelessness. It was neglect. And if you think I'll let Clara grow up believing her safety means less than your budget lines, you're wrong." Philip stood, looming over the desk. His voice dropped to a hiss. "You're a housekeeper, a replaceable line item on payroll. Do not mistake a few bandaged cuts for authority. Drop this, or you'll lose not just your job, but your reputation. I could sue for breach of non-disclosure and ruin you before you even leave this house." His words struck like blows, but Amara held his stare. Her pulse thundered. "Do what you will. I won't be silent." She turned to leave, but a quiet voice stopped her. "You really should mind what you say around here." She froze. In the corner of the office stood a young man in IT uniform, holding a small tool bag. He had been working silently on the estate's server cabinet, headphones dangling around his neck. His name badge read, Marcus Alvarez. Philip barked, "Out! Now!" But Marcus glanced at Amara, then lowered his voice as Philip turned away. "Check the security cameras by the chapel. East Wing server. Last month. You'll find what you need." Amara's heart leapt. She gave the smallest nod of gratitude and slipped from the office before Philip could stop her. Hours later, in the staff lounge, Marcus found her again. He pressed a small USB drive into her bandaged hand. "Raw footage. Don't say where you got it." Amara slid the drive into her pocket, pulse racing. The weight of it felt heavier than stone. It was proof, perhaps the only thing that could clear her name. She returned to her room, locking the door. Her laptop whirred to life, and the video loaded. Grainy footage of the chapel appeared, time-stamped the evening of the accident. She watched the heavy oak door slam, the gust ripple the air, and then the window ruptured, glass cascading. And there, in crystal clarity, Amara lunging forward, shielding Clara with her own body, shards tearing into her arms as she bore the brunt of the collapse. Her throat tightened, tears welling. The truth was there, undeniable. But then she remembered the rumors already circulating online, the post that called her the careless maid. If this footage existed, so could its twin, edited, trimmed to erase the instant of her sacrifice. She pressed play again, rewinding, frame by frame, imprinting the images into her mind. Clara's wide eyes, her own arms outstretched, the storm of glass. This was not just evidence. It was salvation. Yet danger lingered. Philip would not let this surface easily, and the Hartley PR team, she knew, would rather bury truth than risk scandal. Still, she whispered to herself, gripping the USB tightly, "For Clara. For the truth." Down the hall, Philip poured himself another drink, unaware that the story he had tried to suffocate had just found a new breath. And somewhere in the estate's grand, silent halls, a little girl lay in her hospital bed miles away, murmuring Amara's name in her sleep. Manhattan glittered with steel and glass, but in the conference room of Hartley Group's PR division, the air was heavy, the blinds drawn tight, as if even daylight were a threat. Mara Collins stood at the head of the table, laptop open, the faint glow of paused video reflected in her glasses. Around her, a cluster of lawyers and communications officers shifted uneasily. "This is the raw file," Mara said, her voice clipped. She pressed play. The grainy footage flickered to life, the chapel door slamming under the force of the wind, the sudden tremor of air, then the explosion of stained glass raining down. And there, frozen in light and dust, Amara Johnson hurling herself over Clara, arms outstretched, glass slicing into her skin. The room was silent. The truth was undeniable. Mara's jaw tightened. She pressed another key, and a different version of the same footage appeared, shorter, altered. It showed the door slamming, the glass falling, Clara stumbling in fear. But the critical seconds of Amara's shield, the proof of her sacrifice, had been surgically excised. "This," Mara said, pointing to the edited clip, "is what has already circulated online. Notice the timing? It cuts precisely where she covers the child. Whoever leaked it wanted one story. The maid failed." The attorneys whispered among themselves. "If we release the original, it implicates estate management. Liability skyrockets." Mara nodded grimly. "Exactly." The edited version directs public opinion to Amara. One expendable housekeeper is easier to sacrifice than a multi-million-dollar negligence lawsuit. A young associate hesitated. "But the raw video exists. If she has it, then she must be persuaded to keep it buried." Mara interrupted. For the good of the family. At that very hour, Amara sat in her small room at the estate, the USB clutched in her hands. She had watched the footage a dozen times, memorized every frame. Each time her heart clenched at Clara's wide-eyed terror, and at the sight of herself, bleeding but unbroken, shielding the child she loved like her own. Her phone buzzed with a message. Bedford Town Hall. Inspector Jameson requests meeting regarding chapel structural safety. 10 a.m. tomorrow. She stared at the screen. The town inspector, the very office that reviewed building safety violations, wanted her testimony. Was it chance? Or had Marcus quietly passed her name along? Fear and hope wrestled inside her. She imagined Philip's glare, his threats of lawsuits and ruin. She imagined Mara Collins, elegant and ruthless, turning every camera to paint her as reckless. And yet, she thought of Clara whispering her name in the hospital, clutching her bandaged hand for comfort. That memory steadied her. She slid the USB into her pocket. The next morning, Bedford Town Hall's brick facade loomed against the winter sky. Inside, Inspector Jameson, a man in his 50s with weary eyes, greeted her in a small office lined with building codes and safety manuals. "Miss Johnson," he said gently, motioning for her to sit. "I reviewed preliminary reports." The estate manager filed paperwork marking the chapel as structurally sound. "Yet I have reason to believe otherwise." "Do you have information?" Amara's hands trembled as she placed the USB on his desk. "This is the unedited footage from the security cameras. It shows exactly what happened." He inserted the drive, watching carefully as the raw video played. His expression hardened. "The glass failed under stress," he said. "Not from contact. Neglect of maintenance. This corroborates what our inspectors suspected." He leaned back, folding his hands. "Ms. Johnson, you may have just changed the course of this investigation." Amara exhaled shakily. For the first time since the accident, the weight on her chest lifted. Slightly. But back in Manhattan, Mara Collins drafted a confidential memo for Nicholas Hartley. Risk assessment, chapel incident. Her recommendation was stark. Do not engage. Do not release raw footage. Maintain silence. Protect the brand. Sacrifice the maid if necessary. That afternoon, Nick sat in his office on the 42nd floor, the city spread out like a board beneath him. He read the memo once, twice. The words blurred. In his mind, he saw Clara lying pale in her hospital bed. He saw Amara's bloodied hands. He heard his daughter's whisper in the dark. "Only she keeps me safe." But fear and pride still held him. He signed the order to withhold release. Meanwhile, Amara walked home from Town Hall through Bedford's quiet streets, snowflakes drifting down. She felt no triumph, only resolve. The truth was now in official hands. But she knew this was just the beginning. That night, as she sat by her narrow window, she heard footsteps in the hall. A note slid under her door. She unfolded it with care. The words were scrawled hastily. "They know you went to Town Hall. Be careful. M." Her blood ran cold. Marcus had risked himself to warn her. She pressed the window shut against the wind, her heart racing. The cover-up had begun to crack, but those who profited from silence would not surrender easily. And in Manhattan, beneath the towers of glass, the PR machine prepared to bury her deeper. The pediatric wing of Greenwich Hospital glowed faintly in the quiet of night, its hallways dimmed to lavender shadows so the children might rest. Machines murmured their lullabies, the steady beeps of monitors sounding like distant heartbeats. In room 412, Clara Hartley lay restless against white sheets, her body tiny against the expanse of the hospital bed. Nicholas Hartley sat slouched at her side, tie loosened. eyes hollow from exhaustion. The world of Silicon Valley boardrooms and billion-dollar contracts had never demanded as much from him as this single vigil. His phone buzzed constantly with unread messages, Mara Collins forwarding risk assessments, lawyers drafting denials, but all of that blurred in the face of his daughter's small, trembling breath. Clara stirred, her lashes damp with tears even in sleep. Her lips moved. Nick leaned closer, straining to catch the whisper. Amara. The sound of that name, soft, almost a prayer, struck him harder than any market crash ever had. He smoothed Clara's hair, whispering, Daddy's here, sweetheart. You're safe. But when her eyes blinked open, pale blue shimmering with fear, she did not reach for him. She stretched her small hand toward the empty corner of the room. Where's Amara? She keeps me safe. Nick felt his chest collapse in on itself. He took her fingers, pressed them to his lips. You're safe with me. But Clara shook her head. Not safe, unless she holds my hand. Her words hollowed him out. Memory stabbed at him. Amara in the chapel, arms spread like wings, glass carving into her skin as she shielded Clara. And then his own voice at the ER. Your carelessness nearly killed her. The shame of it burned so hot he could barely breathe. The door opened softly. A nurse stepped in to check vitals, her touch gentle as she fastened a blood pressure cuff around Clara's arm. She watched the child's anxious shifting, then glanced at Nick. She calms when Ms. Johnson is near, the nurse said quietly. Children often anchor to the person who shielded them in trauma. If you want her stable, she needs that continuity. Nick blinked. But she's a staff member on leave. It isn't... The nurse shook her head kindly. This isn't about staff. It's about safety. Sometimes healing doesn't come from medicine, but from presence. When she left, Nick stumbled into the hallway, his polished shoes echoing against linoleum. He pressed his palms into his eyes, fighting the storm within him. He had thought removing Amara was the rational choice. Risk management, liability control, the only way to protect Clara. Yet his daughter's body itself rejected that choice, refusing sleep, refusing comfort, until Amara's presence returned. The next morning, a pediatric psychologist arrived for a consult. Dr. Aaron Levin, silver-haired, warm-voiced, carried a clipboard tucked under one arm. He greeted Nick with a firm handshake, then sat beside Clara's bed with a gentleness that carried decades of experience. Hello, Clara, he said, his tone playful but steady. I'm Dr. Levin. I heard you had a scary day. Clara's eyes flicked to her father, then back to the doctor. Her small voice wavered. The glass fell. It was loud. Amara kept me safe. Amara? Dr. Levin tilted his head, jotting notes. Who is Amara? She works at the house. Clara's fingers twisted in her blanket. She held me. I can't sleep without her hand. Nick's throat tightened at the raw plea in his daughter's voice. Dr. Levin observed carefully, then asked Nick to step into the hall. His words, clinical yet kind, carried a weight Nick could not ignore. Your daughter has developed what we call a trauma bond. In the moment of crisis, Ms. Johnson became her shield. That role is now fused in Clara's memory of safety. To separate them abruptly risks deepening her anxiety. Sleep disturbances, panic attacks, delayed recovery, all are likely without the continuity of that caregiver. Nick swallowed. So you're saying she needs Amara? I'm saying, the doctor replied, that from a psychological and medical standpoint, it's not optional. If your priority is Clara's healing, Ms. Johnson must remain close, not as staff, as her trusted caregiver. Nick felt the walls close in. Every instinct of control, every habit of protecting his empire through contracts and dismissals was useless here. His daughter's survival was bound to a woman he had cast out in anger. He returned to Clara's bedside, watching her fight sleep. Each time her eyelids drifted, her small hand twitched, searching for the one she trusted. Nick reached out, but she shook her head weakly, whispering again, "Amara." For the first time in his life, Nicholas Hartley felt utterly powerless. Money could not soothe this. Lawyers could not draft away the need. His daughter's healing required the very woman he had wronged. That evening, as snow dusted the windows of Greenwich Hospital, Nick sat in the dim glow of Clara's room. The inspector's email burned in his mind. Violation, neglect, responsibility, estate management. The truth was clear, but another truth harder still pressed into him. His daughter's heart would not rest until Amara's scarred hands were near again. He bowed his head, the weight of pride cracking at last. Across the hospital, Amara lay in her own bed, her bandaged hands aching, her future uncertain. She did not know yet that a doctor's words had given her a place in Clara's healing, a place no scandal, no rumor, and no pride could erase. The Bedford Town Hall had not seen such a crowd in decades. Beneath its colonial clock tower, television vans lined the parking lot, their satellite dishes tilting toward a pale winter sky. Reporters scribbled notes in the cold, stamping their boots for warmth, while townsfolk pressed close, curiosity mingled with anticipation. Everyone knew this wasn't just about a broken chapel window. It was about truth, about blame, and about the fragile trust inside one of Westchester's wealthiest estates. Inside the chamber, oak benches filled quickly. The murmur of voices rose and fell like the tide. Nicholas Hartley sat at the front, flanked by attorneys in dark suits. His eyes were set, his jaw rigid, but beneath his calm exterior, a storm brewed. The night before, in Greenwich Hospital, he had sat helpless as Clara whispered again and again for Amara. And then Dr. Levin's words, quiet but immovable, echoed in his mind. From a psychological standpoint, Ms. Johnson is essential. Without her, your daughter's recovery is at risk. That truth, heavier than any legal memo, gnawed at him now as he waited for the inspector's report to be read aloud. Mara Collins, head of PR for Hartley Group, leaned toward him, her perfume sharp, her whisper sharper. Stay composed. Emphasize privacy. If pressed, call it a tragic accident. Don't give Johnson more space than necessary. The company's reputation comes first. Nick did not answer. His gaze drifted across the rows until it landed on Amara Johnson. She sat in the second row, hands still bandaged, her back straight despite the stares. Rumors had painted her as reckless, careless, but she did not look like a woman undone. She looked like a woman carrying truth, even if it weighed more than she could bear. The chamber fell quiet as Inspector Jameson approached the podium. He cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and unfolded a file. His voice was steady, the cadence of bureaucracy sharpened now by gravity. After thorough investigation into the collapse of the stained glass window at Hartley Estate Chapel, he began, our findings are clear. The failure resulted not from negligence of supervision, but from structural defects compounded by lack of maintenance. Murmurs swept through the hall. Reporters poised their pens. Jameson continued. Records show a maintenance work order was submitted last month, noting a hairline crack in the chapel window. This report was dismissed without corrective action. Further review indicates that replacement glass installed in 2019 was annealed plate, not laminated safety glazing as required under state code for assembly spaces. Stress fractures accumulated until failure was inevitable. The trigger was a door slam causing pressure differential. The responsible party, therefore, is estate management. A collective gasp rose. Whispers darted like sparks. Jameson's gaze settled firmly on the crowd. Specifically, the record shows this work order was struck through and marked, "Resolved, no action by estate manager Philip Crane." All eyes turned. Philip stiffened, his face blanching. A reporter shouted, "So the housekeeper wasn't at fault?" Jameson raised his hand. "Correct. Security footage, the unedited version, confirms that Ms. Amara Johnson shielded the child with her own body, sustaining multiple lacerations to protect her. Her actions prevented serious harm." The hall erupted in voices, reporters calling questions, townsfolk gasping, heads swiveling toward Amara. She lowered her eyes, her cheeks warming with a mixture of relief and unbearable exposure. Nick's chest tightened. He remembered again Clara's small hand twitching in her sleep, searching for Amara. He remembered the doctor's words, "Continuity of care is not optional." And in that moment, the shame of his earlier accusation threatened to drown him. Philip lurched to his feet. "This is outrageous! She doesn't belong here, but she's twisting this whole thing!" His voice cracked under the weight of panic. Jameson's gavel struck wood. "Order. The evidence is clear. Shortcuts were taken, safety compromised, truth concealed. This violation is recorded." The chamber buzzed with tension. Cameras clicked like rain. Slowly, Nicholas Hartley rose from his seat. His attorneys shifted nervously. Mara Collins shook her head frantically, hissing, "Don't! This isn't in the plan!" But Nick ignored her. He stepped to the podium, his tall frame suddenly vulnerable under the glare of lights. His voice, when it came, was quiet, yet it carried through the chamber like a bell. "I owe this community," he began, "and most of all, I owe Ms. Johnson an apology." The room stilled. "When I found my daughter covered in blood that night, I saw only fear. I lashed out at the one person who had thrown herself into danger for Clara. My words were wrong. My judgment was blind." His voice broke, but he pressed on. "Amara Johnson shielded my child when I was not there to do so. For that, I will forever be in her debt." In the front row, a nurse wheeled Clara into the chamber, against medical advice, but Nick had insisted she attend. Wrapped in a pale blanket, her cheeks still pale from illness, Clara blinked at the crowd. She slipped free of the nurse's hands, tottered down the aisle, and without hesitation slid her small fingers into Amara's bandaged hand. "Only she keeps me safe," Clara whispered, her voice tiny but caught by every microphone. The crowd exhaled as one, an audible sigh, half relief, half awe. Reporters froze, pens hovering uselessly. Neighbors who had once whispered scandal now wiped at their eyes. Nick turned, watching his daughter cling to the woman he had condemned. Tears stung his vision. "If you'll stay," he said, his voice cracking as he addressed Amara directly. "Not as staff, but as family. You'll have my gratitude for the rest of my life." Amara's breath caught. For weeks she had endured whispers, isolation, suspicion. Now truth bathed her in light. Yet humility steadied her. She bowed her head slightly. "I stayed for Clara, not for recognition. But thank you." Behind them, Philip Crane collapsed into his seat, the full weight of exposure crushing his authority. His empire of budget cuts and cover-ups had crumbled in a single morning. Jameson rapped his gavel one final time. "The chapel will remain closed until compliance repairs are complete. Violations will be enforced. Safety cannot be compromised for cost." As people filed out, cameras whirring, Clara clung tighter to Amara's hand. Nick walked beside them, no longer distant, no longer blind. In his mind, Dr. Levin's words echoed once more. Continuity of care is not optional. And now, with the whole world watching, he knew the truth was bigger than scandal, bigger than liability. It was about healing, not just for Clara, but for himself. The winter sun broke through clouds as they stepped outside, shards of light scattering across the town hall steps. Reporters shouted questions, microphones thrust forward, but Nick ignored them. He saw only his daughter, her small hand locked in Amara's scarred one, both bathed in the fragile warmth of daylight. And for the first time since the glass shattered, he felt something like peace. The Hartley estate had grown quieter after the storm of Town Hall. Snow still lined the drive, muffling the world, as if the estate itself was holding its breath. But inside Nicholas Hartley's study, firelight flickered across oak shelves and contracts spread across his desk. He sat alone, pen tapping against the edge of a folder marked Judson Studios Proposal. It should have been simple. Sign, wire funds, replace the chapel window. Yet his hand hovered, unmoving. What weighed on him wasn't the cost. Money was the one resource he had in abundance, but the meaning. This was no longer just about stained glass. It was about memory, about his daughter's trust, about the scarred hands of the woman who had risked everything for a child not her own. His mind replayed the town hall like a film loop, Inspector Jameson's measured voice naming Philip as negligent, the audible gasp when unedited footage was shown, the sharp collapse of Philip's composure. But what lingered most was smaller, quieter. Clara breaking free of the nurse, toddling down the aisle and sliding her fingers into Amara's bandaged hand. Only she keeps me safe. The words had cut through Nick's armor more than any accusation ever could. That night, after returning from the hearing, Clara had refused to sleep until Amara sat by her bedside. Nurses and nannies could not console her. Even Nick's presence, once her unshakable anchor, seemed insufficient. She had clung to Amara, whispering until her breathing softened, and dreams finally came. Dr. Song. Levin's follow-up echoed in Nick's memory. Children emerging from trauma anchor themselves to the protector they trust most. In Clara's case, that's Ms. Johnson. Disrupting that bond would hinder recovery. If you want stability, if you want her nights without terror, you must keep Ms. Johnson near. Now, staring at the Judson proposal, Nick realized the commission could not simply be a repair order. It had to be a declaration of safety, of truth, of gratitude. He picked up the phone. "Book us a flight to Los Angeles," he told his assistant. "Judson Studios. I want to see their workshop myself." The studio smelled of history. Linseed oil, solder, dust of colored glass. High ceilings framed shafts of California sunlight, falling across racks of sapphire, ruby, and amber panes. Craftsmen bent over long wooden tables, tracing lead lines with the care of surgeons. Nick walked slowly among them, Clara's sketchbook clutched in his hand. Beside him, Amara carried herself with quiet wonder. Her bandages were gone now, replaced by faint scars etched like silver rivers along her skin. She touched them unconsciously, as though remembering the night they were written there. The master glazier, a man with steady eyes and hands calloused from decades, greeted them. "Mr. Hartley, we're honored. How can we serve you?" Nick placed the sketchbook on the table and opened it. The drawing was Amara's, 3 figures hand in hand beneath rays of color. A man, a woman, and a child, not saints but family, surrounded by arcs of protective light. "This," Nick said, his voice unsteady, "is what we want. Laminated, tempered, where needed, reinforced mullions. No shortcuts. No substitutions. It must be as strong as it is beautiful." The glazier studied the sketch, then looked at Amara. "You designed this?" Amara's cheeks warmed. It was just something I sketched after Clara asked me what heaven looked like. Nick turned to her, his throat tightening. It's more than a sketch. It's what saved us. And it will stand in that chapel for generations. The commission was signed that day, but Nick added a clause, his pen firm. Design concept credit. Amara Johnson. When she saw the words, Amara shook her head. That's not necessary. It is, Nick said quietly. Clara deserves to know who gave her safety shape. Back in Bedford, word of the commission spread. Some called it extravagance. Others whispered redemption. But the most striking announcement came days later, when Nick held a press briefing not in Manhattan but in Bedford's community hall. He stood at the podium, Clara beside him, Amara behind her. Cameras flashed, but Nick's voice was steady. This chapel taught me a truth no balance sheet ever could, he began. I once thought safety came from walls, security systems, wealth. But when glass fell, it wasn't money that saved my child. It was courage. It was Amara Johnson, who threw herself in harm's way without hesitation. He paused, the silence deep. From this day forward, Ms. Johnson will no longer serve merely as housekeeper. She will serve as family care coordinator for my estate, and most importantly, for Clara. This is not charity. This is necessity. Her presence is what allows my daughter to heal, to sleep, to live without fear. And it is what allows me, as her father, to do the same. Gasps swept the room, followed by a murmur of approval. For weeks, Amara had been whispered about, doubted, dismissed. Now her name was spoken publicly as indispensable. Nick raised a hand for quiet. But this recognition must reach beyond one family. Too often, those who hold up our households, who serve quietly in the shadows, are asked to sacrifice their own children's futures. That must change. Today, I announce the Amara Johnson Scholarship Fund to support the children of service workers in Westchester County who dream of higher education. Because no devotion like hers should go unseen, and no sacrifice unrewarded. The applause thundered, echoing off the hall's beams. For once, the story was not about scandal, but about healing. That evening, as they returned to the estate, Amara stood before the chapel once more. The window frame was still empty, covered in plywood until Judson's masterpiece arrived. Snowflakes fell gently, dusting the ground. Clara tugged Amara's hand. Will it shine like before? Amara knelt, brushing a strand of hair from the girl's cheek. It will shine brighter, little one. And every time you see the colors, you'll remember you were safe. Nick watched from the steps, the fire of shame and gratitude mingling in his chest. He had once accused this woman of carelessness. Now she stood at the heart of his daughter's healing, her role formalized not by guilt, but by truth. And for the first time in years, Nicholas Hartley felt the weight on his chest lift. Not because the estate was restored, not because the scandal was ending, but because a family, unconventional, unexpected, was forming in the glow of second chances. The commission was no longer just about stained glass, it was about legacy. And for Nick, that legacy would not be measured in profit margins, but in the light his daughter would live beneath. The storm that had battered Bedford the night before had passed, leaving the town rinsed in silver dew. The Hartley estate, once weighed down by whispers and scandal, stood in crisp morning light. Frost glistened on hedges, puddles mirrored a pale winter sky, and at the heart of the grounds, the chapel awaited its rebirth. Workers bustled at the entrance, peeling away the plywood that had covered the gaping void for weeks. Behind it, hidden beneath heavy cloths, the new stained glass window from Judson Studios stood ready to meet its first light. Nicholas Hartley stood on the chapel steps. Clara's small hand clasped in his. She wore a white coat buttoned up to her chin, her cheeks rosy from the cold. At her other side, Amara Johnson stood quietly, her scarred hands folded before her. She had chosen a simple navy dress, her hair pinned neatly, but her presence carried a gravity that no attire could disguise. Beyond them stretched a crowd, neighbors, townsfolk, reporters, and even clergy from nearby parishes. Bedford had turned out in force, curious and reverent. They had witnessed scandal, whispers, and accusations. Now they came to witness light. Mayor Ross stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, we gather not only to unveil a window, but to witness truth restored. The Hartley Chapel has long been a landmark, and today it becomes something more, a symbol of courage, of healing, and of the bonds that bind us when storms break." He gestured to Nick. "Mr. Hartley, the honor is yours." Nick moved to the podium set at the chapel doors. His voice, once the polished cadence of a CEO addressing shareholders, trembled now with sincerity. "3 weeks ago," he began, "this chapel was filled with broken glass and fear. I accused the wrong person. I let my pride blind me to sacrifice. But today, we gather not in fear, but in gratitude." He turned slightly, his gaze landing on Amara. "The truth is simple. Amara Johnson threw herself into danger to protect my child. She took the glass so Clara would not. That courage, that love, cannot be repaid, but it can be honored." Murmurs of assent rippled through the crowd. Cameras clicked, but the moment transcended headlines. Nick nodded to the workers. They climbed ladders and began pulling away the heavy cloth. The crowd held its breath. Then, sunlight burst through. The window came alive in rivers of fire. Sapphire, emerald, ruby, and gold poured into the chapel, splashing across stone and wood. The design was unmistakable. 3 figures, hand in hand beneath rays of light. A man, a child, a woman. Not saints in halos, but family, surrounded by arcs of color that curved like sheltering arms. The crowd gasped audibly. Some pressed hands to their mouths. Others simply stood stunned as the colors painted their faces. Clara tugged Amara's hand. "That's us," she whispered, her voice carrying in the hush. "Yes, sweetheart," Amara murmured, her eyes shining. "That's us." Clara slipped free of Nick's grasp and toddled forward until she stood in a pool of ruby light. She turned, holding up her small hand. "Hold me." Amara stepped forward, her scarred fingers closing gently around Clara's. Together they stood in the glow, bathed in sapphire and gold. Nick followed, lowering himself beside them. His arm wrapped around both, his eyes wet. "You were right, sweetheart. Only she keeps you safe." Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras captured the tableau, but for once, the story was not scandal. It was redemption. Nick rose again, voice strong. "From this day, Amara Johnson will not serve as housekeeper. She will serve as family care coordinator for my estate and for Clara, entrusted with overseeing safety, health, and well-being. This is not a title of charity. It is a necessity, affirmed by doctors, by inspectors, and most importantly, by Clara herself." Applause thundered, filling the chapel like a hymn. Nick lifted a hand for quiet. "And beyond this family, we extend that honor to others. Today, the Hartley Group launches the Amara Johnson Scholarship Fund, dedicated to the children of service workers across Westchester who dream of higher education. Because no devotion like hers should remain unseen and no sacrifice unrewarded." The hall erupted again, louder than before. Some wept openly, others clapped until their hands were raw. At the edge of the crowd, Philip Crane was absent, his resignation long since tendered, his name etched in violation records. The cost of his shortcuts was plain. The truth burned through his cover-ups like sunlight through fog. No one mourned his absence. All eyes were on the trio at the altar. Clara pressed her cheek to Amara's hand. Nick placed his arm around both. And behind them, the stained glass window blazed with morning fire, its light spilling across the floor like a hearth flame. From outside, onlookers glimpsed it through the open chapel doors. A family framed in color, not perfect, not traditional, but bound in trust. From a distance, it looked as though a great fire had been lit within the chapel, not of destruction, but of warmth. A hearth of glass and grace, a symbol not only for one estate, but for every heart that had once believed whispers over truth. And so the legacy began. Not in boardrooms or balance sheets, but in the steady light of a chapel window, where a servant became family, a child found safety, and a father learned that true wealth is measured not in fortune, but in love. Thank you, dear friends, for staying with us until the very last light of this journey. If this story warmed your heart, we'd be grateful to have you with us. Please subscribe so you'll never miss the next tale of love, hope, and second chances.